As Ambassador Glassman mentioned, we're here in Texas. This is an especially relevant topic to Texas. It's relevant, we're finding, to America nationwide, but especially so here in the Lone Star State. And it's an interesting comparison. So our project here is the 4% growth project. We're trying to get U.S. GDP about double the rate that it is now. In recent times, we've been growing at about 2 to 2.5% a year. We think that's too slow, and we know we can do better. One way we know we can do better is because, well, in the past, we've grown a lot faster. We've grown at least 4% about a third of the years over the past 60 years. We also know that 4% growth is possible because in states like Texas, here we are today, they grow at 4% or even more. Texas grew, I believe, at 4.8% in the last calendar year. That's the latest data. If you compare that to the US growth, which I said again is between 2 and 2.5%. So we know we can do better, and we know that there are lessons out there in America that can show us how we can do better. We're here today to talk about immigration as well, in addition to growth. And as Ambassador Glassman said, we know that there's some sort of relationship between immigration and growth, and we really want to hone in on that. In Texas, it's home to 4.2 million immigrants. To give a little perspective, there are more immigrants in Texas than there are people in Oklahoma. So I find that's a good thing to, another thing that Texas can brag about. Texas, so the 4.2 million people, that means that about 10% of all immigrants living in America are here in Texas. That's the third most of any state behind California and New York, almost essentially tied with New York. And so that means that 16% of the Texas population is an immigrant. That means about 1 in 6. Give that time a little bit to settle in. That's quite a bit. So if you look around, about 1 in 6 people you see here in Texas will be an immigrant. And in America, it's about 1 in 8, so that compares very favorably. If you look just here in Dallas County, where we're seated right now, it's about 1 in 4. So really, I think we couldn't be a much better place in America to have this discussion right now. And I'm joined by a fabulous panel of experts who are experts both on Texas and nationally. And they're gonna enlighten this and sort of unpack this relationship between growth and immigration here in Texas. So I'll start with Steve Moore. Many of you have probably seen him on TV. He's an editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal. He writes about immigration, taxes, fiscal policy, and many things. I'm sure you've read his articles. You've seen him. He's been an advocate for years and a scholar on immigration, even before he was at the Wall Street Journal. And we're just very privileged to have you here, Steve. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Matt.
Something, Steve, that you do well is that you look state by state a lot. You do things we like here. You talk about growth, and you look at the states and look at evidence. So which states are growing, and what role is immigrants, what are they playing in state economies around the country?
Well, first of all, when Amity called me and asked me to come out here to Dallas to speak at the Bush Institute, I just leapt at the opportunity because I'm just such an admirer of George W. Bush, and so thank you for the invitation to come. Jim, you kind of stole my thunder a little bit because when you talked about 4% growth. I would add to what you said that I don't think we can accomplish 4% growth without immigration. I think it is a precondition to getting to that higher growth rate. And by the way, the only problem I have is I think 4% growth is maybe too low. We're now in the fourth year of a non-recovery, right, in the economy. There's no reason the economy can't be growing much faster than it is, and even aspiring to 5 or 6 or 7% growth for several quarters, which, by the way, we had in the early 1980s. Now, it's interesting if you look at the period that what I call the kind of quarter century of spectacular, unprecedented growth in America from 1980 to 2005. That was a period when we averaged almost 4% growth, and yet over that same time period, we had unprecedented immigration. We allowed into the country legally well over 20 million Americans, new Americans, during that period. And people who say that immigration is bad for the economy or depresses wages or causes high unemployment, I mean, the actual evidence shows just the opposite, that the biggest boom period in American history was also the period of the greatest immigration. That doesn't mean the immigrants caused the growth, but it certainly is circumstantial evidence. A second point is with respect to states. It is so interesting. We do a lot of work at the Wall Street Journal we've probably devoted at least 10 editorials over the last few years comparing California and Texas. And
a good comparison.
It is a good
if you're in Texas.
It is a good comparison if you're a Texan, and it's a good comparison if you believe in free markets.
A lot of people are moving from California to Texas.
Well, that's absolutely
so they're reading your editorials. Sorry.
And so what you've seen over the last 5 years, roughly, these are just rough numbers, about 1 million new jobs in the state of Texas in the last 5 years, and roughly 1 million lost jobs in California. That's amazing. In fact, one of the points that Art Laffer and I make, we're writing a book on this, is that what we're really seeing right now is one of the great wealth transfers in American history geographically from states like California that don't get it right, my home state of Illinois being another example, and states that do get it right, like Texas. And this is one reason to be very bullish on the future of Texas. Now, the interesting thing also is that Texas and California are the 2 highest immigration states. And one of the interesting things is that Texas does a much, much better job, in my opinion, of economically assimilating immigrants so that they're successful here. California is much more of a welfare state. It indoctrinates immigrants into the welfare system at a much higher pace than Texas does. People come to Texas, in my opinion, for jobs. People go to California for welfare. And so you're seeing, I think, the differing economic outcomes as a result of this. Texas is the model that other states should be emulating. A last point, if I may, just because this is on the top of my mind. I would urge all of you, if you haven't had a chance to read our editorial this morning about immigration, which I was lucky to get here last night because I was working on this till a little late at night. But one of the points we made is that the United States of America has such an incredible opportunity that is so much larger than any other nation has, because most of the people in the world who are talented and skilled and educated and ambitious, their first choice of where they want to go to if they want to leave their home country is to come to the United States. They don't want to go to Israel. They don't want to go to Germany. They don't want to go to France. They don't want to go to Japan. They want to come to the United States. And we have such an incredible opportunity to, if I may use the word, exploit that opportunity for the benefit of American citizens. And that's, I think, what this whole immigration debate is and should be about, is how do we have an immigration policy which is good for the immigrants, which is obvious, but also good for American citizens. And I'm very worried that this immigration debate in Washington is migrating in the wrong direction. Last point I'll make. I hear 100 times a day in Washington, what are we going to do about America's immigration problem? Immigration problem? America doesn't have an immigration problem. We have an immigration opportunity and an immigration advantage over the rest of the world. And that is something that needs to be exploited. I always say when people say, China is going to surpass the United States, I've said this 100 times. China is not going to surpass the United States economically because our Chinese are smarter than their Chinese, right? And so this is an enormous advantage, and we ought to exploit it. And it really is something that is so important. So thank you for having this conference.
Yeah, Steve said to follow up on one theme. So you talk about where there are a lot of immigrants, a lot of times there's a lot of growth. So states, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the growth in immigration to different states has actually been away from states like California and New York, although they've still had a lot of growth, but to states in the South, states like Louisiana, Mississippi. What's happening in some of those states in terms of growth? Are they helping growth or are they hurting?
That's a really important point. This is one of the kind of interesting demographic changes in America over the last 25 years. Richard Vedder is the expert on this, who you'll hear from a little later. Traditionally, immigrants have shunned the South. Other than Texas. In fact, that's been a problem for growth in the South since the end of the Civil War. Now you're seeing Dixie really attracting a lot of the immigrants. States like North Carolina, one of the states that has had the biggest percentage increase in immigration over the last 15 years has been Georgia. And Georgia actually has become a high growth state. And this gets to the point people ask, are immigrants more attracted to a state that has high welfare benefits, or are they attracted to a state that has jobs? And so we looked at some of this evidence, and what we found was that, on balance, immigrants are much more likely to go to states with low unemployment rates than they are to go to states with high welfare benefits, which is an important finding, I think, because it says people are coming here because they want a job, not because they want a welfare check.
Which seems to make logical sense too, right? If you're going to leave your home country worldwide, not that many people do that. If you're going to make out somewhere new,
Matt, it makes sense, but you wouldn't, there are so many people on the other side of this issue who think that immigrants come here for welfare. And look, some do, some do, but the vast, vast majority don't. They come here because they want economic opportunity and they want a job.
That's a very important point. So next, we're gonna focus in even more on Texas, and we're all incredibly lucky here to have Pia Orrenius. Pia is a national, even an international expert on immigration issues. She's the author of a chapter in the Bush Institute's first book, The 4% Solution, looking at growth and immigration broadly, and it presents a lot of great evidence. She's the author of a fabulous book called Beside the Golden Door. But she's also at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas as a senior economist studying immigration. So Pia, I want to ask you, where's the growth in the Texas economy coming from? We've heard so much about it. We hear the numbers, the percentage increase. Where's the growth coming from?
When I talk to the media, I try to sort of simplify it by saying, rather than going through each sector that's responsible for growth in Texas, I sort of say, well, there's three main components of growth to Texas, and then there's what Steve was talking about. But the three main sort of innate components are geology, which is really oil and gas, which is huge right now.
Which we'll have a conference on in September. I'll just plug that real quick.
And so there's geology, and then I talk about geography, which is so that I can talk about manufacturing and trade. We have a huge...
Pia, maybe hold on just 1 second so we can actually hear your wisdom. 1 second. Sorry, everybody.
Pia, we thought you were going to tell us whether Ben Bernanke was going to ease. Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Well, I'm a little distressed. You guys have been studying up on your Texas economic statistics.
Yeah.
So you're kind of stealing my material. But that's all right. I got more stuff.
Okay, so Pia, you were telling us about some of the sectors in a way that that our audience can understand. We don't need to go, you're saying there's been some growth
international trade,
Yep.
manufacturing international trade, the downstream industries like petrochemicals have been huge. In Texas, a big component of growth, more recently, oil and gas, of course, as it was traditionally. And the third factor really is demographics. So not only a high natural population growth rate, but also lots and lots of immigration to the state. And not just international immigration, but domestic migration, which I think Steve mentioned from California and so forth. And it's been interesting in recent years, in the 1990s, international immigration really took off to Texas and became extremely important. It was more important than domestic migration, but in recent years, domestic migration has been even more important than international migration to the state. So it just shows the growth differential with the rest of the United States is broadening. In fact, if you look, and I'll admit, the 4% growth project, I mean, it sounds like a lofty goal, but it's amazing to look at Texas in the recovery, in the economic recovery after the Great Recession and see that we're actually averaging over 4% growth. Inflation adjusted even.
The state
of
Texas.
The state of Texas, yes. So it's an amazing growth time, especially now, but it's been traditionally over time. I mean, since the 1970s, basically, when the Texas economy took off. And the other point I want to make is that there's also been a big transformation of the Texas economy. We went from the 1970s, and before then, most of the 20th century, we were the oil, the cotton, and the cattle state. And it really wasn't until the 80s, and especially the 90s, that we transformed ourselves into a modern industrial service sector-based economy. And this transition, it came to really, I think, thanks to two factors. One was $10 oil. If you remember in the 90s, in the late 90s, oil was that cheap.
Dream about that, yeah.
And so that decimated our oil and gas industry at the time and forced us to change. And luckily for Texans, Texas is a state that's been able to change. But that's also been because of immigration. Immigration in particular of high-skilled immigrants, which we tend to have a shortage of.
Yeah, so high-skilled immigrants here in Texas are in a bit of a shortage. Texas is a little unique from other states where a large percentage don't have even a high school degree, always. Are they good for the economy too? A lot of times when we hear, people will say, they'll agree, sure, we should bring in every PhD scientist that we can find to start new Googles, right? Who would disagree with that? But what about those without even high school degrees? What role do they play in the Texas economy? Are they good?
It's fun to talk about Texas. I mean, it's just because it's all good news, especially now. And even, so when we look at our immigrants, 60% of our immigrants are from Mexico. And nationally, it's less than 30% of immigrants nationally are from Mexico. And Mexican immigrants tend to have low levels of education. And that's true in Texas, and they also tend to be less likely to speak English fluently. And so we see all that in the statistics for Texas. But what's amazing about Texas, when you look more closely at these immigrants, they have much higher employment rates than low-skilled immigrants nationally, and they have much lower unemployment rates than low-skilled immigrants nationally, and they tend to do quite well. Their wages are stable. Their wages have not are stable, and especially compared to the rest of the nation, they do very well in this economy.
Since the recession, when wages have been falling.
Yes, wages, right. And so in Texas, on average, wages are actually turned up in the last couple of years, and I was sort of speculating the other day about the shale boom, or wages turning up in Texas and falling in the rest of the nation. And so it's just testament again to the success story of the economic miracle of Texas, and not just in the recovery, but even long term. We have lots and lots of low-skilled immigration, and they've contributed tremendously to the growth of the state.
What about high-skilled? Let's turn back to that just for a moment. Has Texas become better at attracting high-skilled industries? We hear about so many businesses moving to Texas. Has that brought more high-skilled immigrants in the last several years?
The bringing in of the high-skilled immigrants goes further back than that. I mean, it goes back to the 90s. I was talking about the transformation of the Texas economy has been just absolutely crucial, the immigration of high-skilled. So we've brought, basically, again, Texas, as a commodities-based economy for a long time, we relied on low-skilled labor, and we didn't really have a huge need for high-skilled labor, but that's all changed now, and luckily we've been able to bring them in, and they've been instrumental in the high-tech sectors, in telecom, in research and development, in the healthcare, and education. And education are teachers and professors and so forth that are high-skilled and obviously international immigrants.
Great. And now I want to give a little bit of context, and we're lucky here to have Javier Palomarez. Javier leads the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. You represent businesses across America, many of them here in Texas. And so I'm hoping you can give us, we've heard facts and numbers and percentages and all sorts of things, but you represent actual companies, real people here on the ground. And so I'm hoping you can tell us about some of the businesses you represent here in Texas, and what role immigrants are playing in helping them be successful.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Matthew, and thank you to Ambassador Glassman and what the Institute is doing. I think it's a real service to the American public, and
Thank you.
We're very thankful to be part of this. The United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce represents some 3.1 million Hispanic-owned firms in this country that together contribute about $465 billion to the American economy every year, and growing. In fact, the fastest growing segment of American small business is the Hispanic business community. We also advocate on behalf of about 198 major American corporations, and we do our work through a network of over 200 local chambers of commerce and business associations throughout the United States. We're particularly proud of the fact that we advocate on behalf of those people who are the practitioners. We up here write, talk, and advocate on behalf of business owners, but it's always kind of thrilling to meet the practitioners, the ones who are actually creating the jobs.
Absolutely.
And I'm very happy that we have some members of our association here. We have 4 of those 3.1 million Hispanic-owned firms or members of the USHCC. And I can't see them here, but I know they're in the crowd. First of all, Patricia Stout is with us today. Patricia began a company called Alamo Travel Group. Patricia her company's headquartered in San Antonio, Texas. She immigrated here from Mexico. Last year, her company did about $138 million of top-line revenue, and she employs close to 100 Texans. We also have a gentleman named Luis Spinola with us here today. Luis also immigrated to the United States from Mexico. His company's here in Dallas, and he owns a company called Azteca Enterprises. And if you've ever crossed the beautiful Trinity River Bridge that just came up that everybody's talking about, or if you visited Jerry Jones's house, the stadium, it may be Jerry Jones's house, but Luis Spinola helped build it.
We all wish we had visited.
Luis's company last year did about $122 million of top-line revenue, and he employs over 250 Texans. We have with us Frank Mahach, who, while not Hispanic, is the grandson of Czech and German immigrants who came to this state looking for opportunity. And today, Frank manages and farms over 3,200 acres of dryland sorghum in South Texas. And finally, we have Nina Vaca with us. Nina is from Dallas. but she immigrated to the United States from Ecuador, and she runs a company called Pinnacle Technical Resources. Pinnacle last year did about $250 million of top-line revenue, and she employs over 3,700 people. About 1,000 of them are Texans. These are the practitioners. These are the American dream incarnate. They are the ones driving the Texas economy forward. They are the ones creating the jobs, paying down the tax bill. And at the end of the day, what this is about is what they do every day. And so I can't see you, but if you would stand up and be acknowledged by the group, that would be wonderful if you could.
Thank you for being here.
That's the American dream right there. Every one of them could have chosen any state in the nation to start their business or continue their business. And the fact is they chose Texas for all the right reasons. And I think they're living proof of what this state has to offer to the immigrant entrepreneur.
So why did they choose Texas, in your estimation? We could ask all of them, but for the sake of time, we'll ask you. What are some things about Texas that makes it, especially friendly for immigrants or other people who are coming here and want to start a business that can grow to that kind of level and really drive the growth that then we all benefit from?
Well, in the case of these 4 individuals, and again, I'm in no position to speak for them, but I can generally, I think, surmise that in the case of these 4 individuals, the conversations I've had with them, you look at the sectors they're in. They're in technology, they're in services, travel, they're in construction, they're in agriculture. So you're looking for people who want to work.
Both high and low skilled, like people.
Absolutely. And they're at every, both spectrums on the skill, both ends of the spectrum in terms of skills, from very highly technical positions, such as the jobs that Pinnacle Technical Resources has, to, by the way, I wouldn't say low skilled, I would just say differently skilled work that happens in the agriculture and the construction sectors. But in all of these cases, they recognize that this is a state where workers are ready, willing, and able, because the state makes it possible for them to get engaged, for them to work, and for them to build their own individual wealth as a family and an employee, but at the same time help that enterprise continue to grow.
One more follow-up for you, Javier. It seems like we hear this everywhere, and it kind of irks me. It seems like it's almost conventional wisdom, and I don't think it is. We hear, well, we have to make these protections for American workers. This idea that, and it just sort of facilitates this myth that immigrants come and take jobs. We always hear this, they come and take jobs. Yeah. And even, our leaders in Washington on either side, they seem content to always just say, to kind of buy into that by saying, yeah, we need to build in protections for American workers. Mm-hmm. But ignoring the protections, what do you respond to people that say, well, immigrants come and take jobs?
I think that we would do well to really kind of look at what has transpired in some other states, neighboring states. You look at what happened in Alabama recently. That state passed what I consider to be a fairly draconian anti-immigrant piece of legislation. And the fact of the matter is, when it's all boiled down, you look at the end of the case here, they had some 40,000 workers just get up and leave the state. What ensued is that the state lost about $10 billion of revenue and about $500 million of taxes that it could have garnered had those workers stayed in the state, worked the crops, worked in the plants, worked in the construction sites. And so I think there's a lesson learned. I think that sentiment was part of what happened in Alabama. I'm hopeful that will never be the case in the state of Texas. And frankly, I think that Governor Bush, then President Bush, really illustrated some real leadership in terms of his understanding of the immigrant communities, in terms of the work that immigrants come here to do. I think he welcomed immigrants to the state of Texas. I remember very fondly his relationship with President Fox, then President of Mexico, and a very, I think, clear and clear-minded understanding of the contributions that immigrants make to the state of Texas. So there are lessons to be learned when you study what's happened in states that do believe that immigrants are there to take their jobs.
Right.
The fact of the matter is no one came back and filled those jobs that those immigrants left untended.
Right. That's a perfect segue. I want to come back to you, Steve, and ask what are some lessons for other states? If Texas has had this great growth, a lot of it driven by demographics and immigrants, what are lessons for some other states? Because if we want the whole country to get to 4% growth, we need, Texas can carry its weight, but we need some help.
Well, one of the things when you talk about where the growth is in this country, and Texas has had so much growth and in migration, as you were talking about, and whenever the people who disagree with my free market philosophy, address that, they say, well, yeah, people are going to southern states because of, the nicer climate, the snowbirds from Minnesota and Michigan and Illinois. And, it's interesting. I guarantee you, as wonderful as Dallas is, I guarantee you, people are not moving from San Diego to Dallas for the weather. When it's 100 degrees.
Especially in July.
Right now it's 74 degrees in San Diego. Yeah. So, Texas has a, and I just think this is fascinating, and you probably know more about this than me. Why is it that Texas does such a better job assimilating immigrants into the society in a much better way than California does? And I think it's something we need to really study more. And I think it's partly because Texas, this is just a supposition on my part, Texas has that kind of free enterprise mentality that some of these states like California don't. Now, one point I would make is, we've talked a lot about Hispanic immigrants. I live in Washington, D.C., and you were asking what other states where immigrants are going. We're seeing a big increase in immigration in the kind of coastal states. And so when you go to it's an interesting phenomenon. When you go to the beach towns, the resort towns along the East Coast now, almost, I would say 75 to 80% of the service workers working at the hotels and restaurants and so on are Eastern Europeans. Yeah. They're Russians, they're Czechs, they're Polish, and it's really an amazing phenomenon that they've kind of taken over those occupations. And look, has there been some job displacement? Probably, yeah. It used to be, whites and blacks that had those jobs. Now they're going to Eastern Europeans. But what's interesting is Washington Post did a big story on this, and I very rarely quote the Washington Post, but they were saying,
we don't get fired.
They interviewed a lot of these people who would, most of them were very new immigrants. Some of them who had just arrived. And I just thought it was really fascinating, the attitude of these immigrants. Several of them, told this reporter, the great thing about America is there's all these jobs. And that's not something Americans think, right? Like, there's all these jobs. And the other thing that a lot of these immigrants said was that the other great thing about America is that if you work hard, you can get ahead in this country.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I was here in Texas, a month or two ago, and I was in a taxi, and it was actually a small business. It wasn't just one little taxi, and the driver was an immigrant. And I asked him about his experience coming to America. He said, when I arrived here, it was like I had woken up, and my eyes were fresh, and I saw all these opportunities. And he said, those just weren't available to me back in my other country.
And I think it's a kind of ambitious drive that is unique to immigrants. I mean, let's face it. There's an old saying, 99% of the people in the world never move more than 100 miles from where they grew up, right? So we're talking about that 1% of the people who are ambitious enough and courageous enough to make a decision. To leave your homeland is a very courageous thing to do, right? And so this is as an economist, I don't know if you'd agree with this, I just think this is one of the kind of innate advantages of having immigration is that number one, they're pre-selected for kind of economic success. And number two, and this gets back to my point about China, because let's face it, the biggest issue for the next 50 years is whether the United States of America or whether China will be the world economic leader. I think that's really the biggest issue on the world stage. And I was only kind of half kidding. The big advantage we have over China is that we are a melting pot, and China is a totally homogeneous population. And I believe that gives America a huge competitive edge. I mean, if you go to places like, I was out at Microsoft out in Seattle, and it's like a college campus there. It's so huge. And I gave a lecture there, a lunch lecture. They had about 300 of their engineers come up. It was like the United Nations. I mean, it was people from every country of the world. Nowhere else in the world do you have that kind of dynamism and melting pot than you do in the United States of America. And I happen to think that's a big advantage.
Yeah, P.S. I want to turn to you and follow up a little bit on something that Steve brought up. Why do you think Texas is so good at assimilating immigrants into its economy, into its society? And also, something you might lend some light on is, what are some of the trends, or are they still doing that well? Are they doing it better? Immigrants who come, as they live here longer, do they gain more education? Can you just talk about that assimilation process some here in Texas?
Well, I think in Texas is a microcosm of the U.S. In the sense that the U.S. does a lot of things right about immigration. And me being originally from Sweden, I go back and they just had horrible protests recently, in some of these immigrant areas around Stockholm. And I look at the U.S. and I always think, what are we doing right about immigration? And the thing really I think that the U.S. does right is it puts people to work. You can devise, all countries take different perspectives on this. I mean, in Europe, traditionally, it's been a lot of refugees and asylum seekers coming into Europe, and they've been placed deliberately left out of the labor market, prohibited from working for several years, and put deliberately on welfare. It's not that they chose welfare, but they were deliberately put there because they're protecting, German workers or Swedish workers by being out of the labor force. And so I think they've totally got it backwards, because the best way to assimilate people is to get them into the labor force and working. Again, looking at the contrast, what have they done in Germany when they say, well, we can't assimilate our immigrants, but they're not learning German. They're not participating in the labor force. Well, so they devised these long courses. Now you have to take 100 hours of German instruction over the next 6 months so you can learn German. Well, how do we do it in the US? We say, well, you can speak whatever language you want, but go to work. And amazingly, people go to their workplace and they learn English on the job. I mean,
and companies
who would
help
have
them a
thought?
lot.
And they get along that way, they get experience, and they value the society in which they're in because they're actually, benefiting from it in a tangible way. They're seeing the results of the fruit of their efforts. And I think, gosh, Western Europe, they were starting to come around. They're starting to understand the significance and importance of employment-based immigration, that it's not just for the U.S. businesses so that our businesses can prosper, but it's also for the immigrants. It is the best way for them to assimilate and to appreciate the society which they come into.
Javier, you, like I said, you represent businesses across the country. So what are I know you've talked about some other states that have passed unfortunate laws, but kind of to tie this together a little bit, is what we're seeing in Texas happening in some other states too? Where should we be watching? Where are immigrants, especially a promising source of future growth in other places?
Yeah, I think there are other states that are beginning to emulate what we're doing in Texas. I'd like to kind of go back to the point that Steve was making earlier in terms of this is the place where immigrants from every corner of the globe come. Imagine trying to start Yahoo in Afghanistan or eBay in some other nation.
Yeah, sure.
And the reality of it is they come here for a reason. But if you study the impact of immigrant entrepreneurs on our economy historically, some of the most iconic brands in the world were created by immigrant entrepreneurs that came to America. Some 40-something% of the Fortune 500 corporations were started by an immigrant. And if you study that phenomenon, iconic brands like AT&T, Bank of America, eBay, Google, Intel, Kohl's, Yahoo, they were all started by immigrants, and they were all started here in the United States for a reason. I think if you bring that back down to the state of Texas and what Texas is doing, I think, first of all, we are leading the way. Texas is the #1 state when it comes to exports to other nations. And it's important to recognize, and I think the state of Texas does, principally because of the leadership that was shown by George W. Bush, is that when you look at states like Arizona, not to pick on Arizona, but they're the first, I just thinking A's today, I hit Alabama, now I'm hitting Arizona. Arkansas is next, but if you look at Arizona, if memory serves, Arizona exports something like $50 billion a year. If you look at Texas, we export $206 billion a year, and 35% of those exports go directly to Mexico. I think George W. Bush understood the tenuous but important relationship that has to exist with our neighbors in the South. I think he was very strategic and smart in building and growing and fostering that relationship over time. And today, Texas is benefiting from his leadership back then. A large proportion of the Hispanic-owned firms in the state and minority-owned firms in the state are actually owned by Mexican nationals. And so this didn't happen by accident. It happened because very strategic, visionary leadership happened 2-3 decades or a decade ago. And now we're benefiting from that.
It created an environment.
Absolutely. It doesn't happen overnight. And so now you're seeing other states beginning to recognize that and trying to emulate that. The beauty of Texas is that there's no shortage. There's no stopping this state right now at the rate at which it's going. It's really good news. But I do see other states trying to kind of study what's happening here and trying to learn how to harness, to Steve's point, the opportunity that immigrants represent to the state. And ultimately to the nation.
Pia, one question. We're going to open it up to audience questions here shortly because we want to hear from everybody. A question for you. We hear some about the situation in Mexico. The economy is improving quite a bit and some demographic changes there as well. What does that mean for Texas, a state where, as you said, about 60% of the immigrants here in Texas are from Mexico? What are some of those kind of international changes? What does that have in store for Texas, do you?
Well, it means less immigration from Mexico. So we've already started to see that. And I think even whether you look at unauthorized or authorized immigration, I think we're seeing a slowing flow from Mexico. And I think that's going to continue into the future. On the benefits side, though, of that is that we're very excited about the reforms in Mexico. And if you think of the Texas economy right now, we're in the middle of a big shale oil and gas boom. And the economy, like we talked about earlier, is growing very quickly. And of course, what we're really hoping, as economists at the Dallas Fed, or as Texans also, is looking into Mexico and saying, they're talking about an energy reform. Wow, can you imagine this shale in South Texas extends into northern Mexico? And so, wow, that would be really good for the Texas economy. So we're already, hitting records in terms of our exports of natural gas to Mexico. And so everything good in Mexico is paying off in spades for Texas. And so we're just so excited about, more good things to come.
Let me just say one thing about this. One of the things that really bothers me about this, I'm in Washington, so I'm involved every day with this immigration debate. And maybe some of you in this room may not agree with me on this, but the United States Senate just passed a bill to put $30 billion more in basically, quote, securing the border with, I don't know if they want to build a Berlin Wall or what, but, the whole idea of the integration of the Texas and Mexican economy, which really began with NAFTA, is such a positive thing. And I just hate this idea that we're going to kind of wall off America from Central America, because, as you said, the integration of these economies has been such a positive thing. Thank you. I'm glad some of you agree with that. Nobody in Washington agrees.
You're still here.
May I add a point?
Sure.
Because I feel the same way Steve does. I just can't be as irreverent as Steve can be about it. But I admire so much the plain-spoken truth. I had an opportunity to speak to the President Obama right on
He's not the president here.
On his eve right as he was departing to Mexico. And of course, we talked about immigration reform, and I, of course, wanted to talk about it from an economic perspective, and that was fantastic. And so I said, Mr. President, the reality of it is you wouldn't be Mr. President were it not for the Hispanic vote. Never in the history of this country has the Hispanic community played such a critical role in electing an American president. And perhaps more interesting than that is never again will there be an American president without courting the Hispanic vote. But the reality of it is that as the leader of the nation, sir, I implore you to please begin to change the narrative that has for time immemorial defined the relationship between Mexico, Latin America, and the United States.
That's such an important point. So often we forget, and not just with Mexico, we forget that trade is a good thing. When we open up our opportunities and we participate in these world markets, everybody benefits.
Every time I hear about it, and again, these are the facts, but every time I hear about it, the narrative is got words like illegal immigration and drug wars and border crossings and so forth. And again, that is true, and we're not turning a deaf ear or a blind eye to that. But the reality of it is Mexico is still the second largest trading partner to the United States and has been for decades and will be for decades to come. Bigger than England, bigger than France, bigger than Brazil, bigger than India, bigger than Japan, and yet we never hear about that. The reason Texas is in the position it's in is because it had a governor at a time that knew that importance and courted that partner, that economic business partner. Today, we're reaping that benefit. To Pia's point, if the shale becomes what it could be, if we didn't have the relationship we currently have with Mexico because of George W. Bush, we wouldn't be in the position to be able to take advantage of that opportunity that exists. But as a nation, we would do well to recognize the economic importance of the relationship between Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for making that point. That's something that I think we all need to remember more. We now have some time for questions from the audience, and we would love to hear from you. We have such a great panel here, and so we want to take full advantage of them with the time that we have left. So if you could raise your hand if you do have a question. We have some microphones around the room. I just ask that you please give us your name so we know who you are, and also if you're here with an organization, let us know. And I just ask also that you please ask a question rather than give a long statement. We don't have that much time, but we're happy to take questions.
By the way, while we're waiting for the first question,
sure.
When you asked me about where immigrants are going now, the state over the last 2 years that has had the biggest percentage increase in immigration has been North Dakota.
Yeah.
Because North Dakota is the state with, even.
Well, we talk about 4% growth. I think North Dakota's had over 8% growth.
But anyway, it's just interesting that you've got this state that you've got Mexican immigration into North Dakota now, and it just demonstrates the point that immigrants go where the
work is. Absolutely,
exactly. Okay,
Hello.
First question.
Hi, my name is Dina Jackson. I'm with the Dallas Women's Foundation, and this may be a question for Pia or Javier. With immigration being such an important engine for Texas's growth in our past, I'm very concerned about our issues with educating many of our Hispanic youth in this country, both through K through 12 as well as through the college stage. And is that going to, our inability to provide a strong education, going to be a hindrance in the future?
Pia, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. I think that you hit on a very important point that we absolutely needed to touch on in this conversation. And I think that just as we benefit tremendously from immigration into Texas in terms of our economic growth and so forth, immigrants that tend to come in obviously are working age and they're already educated and pretty much their education is done. And so the job for us then becomes, to educate their children, which will be our future. So that is a very important task, and I think that's something where with growth comes all these responsibilities to fund to a greater extent, obviously, education and healthcare. And I think that's something probably the legislature has been struggling with in putting together the budget. Obviously, it was easier this time than last time, but when you have so much population growth, every year our population grows by over 400,000 people. Half of those are immigrants. With some of them with large families and so forth. So I think that we have to have a clear understanding that when we grow this fast and we attract these many people, this comes with large responsibilities, education and healthcare foremost, but even infrastructure, roads and water.
Mm-hmm. Steve, anything to add? No? Okay.
Yeah, I'll add a point to that. I think when you look at the issue of immigration, there's a huge correlation, I think, between, or an intersection between immigration reform, business, and education and business. First of all, at the United States Hispanic Chamber, we're not a political organization. We don't take sides. We're a business association, so it's about free trade, economic growth, job creation, et cetera. And for the longest time, we've struggled as to whether we should even have or voice an opinion as it relates to education. But certainly in the Hispanic community, there's a real challenge in terms of getting our youth to the proverbial next level in terms of secondary education. But if you look at it, education is an economic issue. It is a business issue. As a nation, I think the sooner we begin to grapple with the notion that we've got to have a prepared and educated nation, which means educating the kids that come after us, we're not going to be the economy that we are. And at the end of the day, the greatness of this country, to a large extent, rests on the fact that we have a phenomenal economy. Again, the economy that the rest of the world comes to and where all innovation or the majority of innovation happens. But at a very concerning rate. We are running out of educated and trained and prepared individuals to take us to the next growth opportunity. And so I think that there is a place for business to take an ownership of the education challenge. I'm very pleased when I see organizations, by the way, AT&T, by the way, member of the USHCC, and by the way, headquartered in Dallas, Texas, invest, I believe, through their investment to help stem the tide of high school dropouts. They've invested some $300 million this year alone to try to help that. But I think it's critically important. I think it's going to take all of the players in our community, including your organization, which is obviously at the lead of trying to create the thought process that's going to get us there. But I don't think we'll get to the solution we need as a nation unless business gets involved. And Texas, again, I think is leading the way in illustrating that businesses and business leaders who are visionary see that correlation and are investing real dollars in helping kind of solve that problem.
On this issue about the costs of immigration with respect to education, especially the children, you know, those are very real issues for states, especially the ones that have, you know, a big surge in immigration. But looking at the big picture, one of the reasons immigrants are such a huge economic advantage to the United States is because if you look at the most recent census data, about 65% of immigrants come to the United States between the ages of 18 and 35. They're right in the sweet zone, right when they're at the start of their working life. So when you think about it, if an immigrant comes to this country at the age of 20, it's like reverse foreign aid. It's like the home country spent all this money educating these immigrants, and then they come to the United States. If you view a human being as an investment, right, the first 15 to 20 years of a person's life is all cost, right? And then during their working years is when you get the payoff from the investment. The reason immigration is such a huge asset to the United States is we don't have to pay for the education costs for the most part of the immigrants. The sending country does. And that is, you know, as I said, the value of that each year to the United States is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, your point is right. The immigrants have children. And in fact, they have more children on balance than Americans do. So there are those education costs for states like Texas, but let's not forget, on balance, immigrants actually are contributors to the public education system, not costs to it.
Pia, you had something you wanted to add.
Sorry.
Oh no, that's fine, I totally agree. I just wanted to add a couple of things. Dina, you know that we just got recent data out about a sharp increase in the high school graduation rates among Hispanics. So that's true for Texas, also true for the nation, I believe. So that's really good news. I think we're still trying to understand and process this because the increases are large, and so I think we're trying to understand how it's happening. But I mean, it's suggesting that, so like the state demographers' projections might be way off in terms of projecting out, 30 years from now, still 20% of native-born Hispanics are going to drop out of high school. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case, hopefully. So that's hopefully changing, and we're seeing the beginning of that changing. And the other thing I wanted to say quickly was, we focus a lot on education, but we did an interesting study at the Dallas Fed on poverty and the poverty gap, and we were looking at natives and immigrants. And the fascinating thing that we came up with was we focused so much on education, but the biggest discrepancy, the biggest explanatory factor for high poverty rates among Hispanic immigrants was English. And so I kind of poked fun at the Germans earlier, so I'll take back a little bit about that, because we found that not being able to speak English well or fluently explained over half the poverty gap between Hispanic immigrants and natives. So that was a huge factor. So that's really, really important. And I think we could do more there. I don't think that gets as much attention.
Great. Another question, please. Sure, here in the front. Thank you.
My question is, what would you have done had you lived next door to the U.S. and you couldn't supply your family with food, clothing, shelter, education, transportation, but you knew a country that the ratio of economics for the minimum wage was 10 times greater in this country next door? What would you have done for your family?
Sure. Here, let's ask the panel real quickly. Thank you. So I think that gives us, to a good point. People kind of by chance are born in one country or another, and it seems natural that they want to follow the opportunity. So how about the panel? What do you think we would do?
I would have bothered God yet again with yet another request, and I'd have gone to that neighboring country.
I think a problem too. Let's talk a little bit about. So some of the barriers, and I know Pia and Steve, you both have written about this, is that we don't have good ways to come here. That's part of the problem. That's part of the debate in Washington. We don't need to get into the specifics of the current bill, but what are some of the problems about not having a way to come into the country?
Well, and that's a good point, because if you sort of seal the border with Mexico, and so, I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the the great majority of unauthorized immigrants come here for work, and so those work opportunities are going to be open, and how are they going to be filled? Are they going to be filled with visa overstayers? Are they going to be filled with, illegal immigrants? Are they going to start coming in from Canada? Are they going to come on boats? I mean, it's interesting to think, if you're not going to fill the void with some workers, that was a void that was previously being filled by unauthorized immigrants coming across the U.S.-Mexico border, then how is this going, how is this going to play out? What are the unintended consequences of doing what they're planning to do?
Yeah.
Steve, what are some other, what's the most sort of pro-growth way we could provide a way for people to come here and work?
Well, first of all, I think this gentleman has a great point. I mean, I was in West Texas hunting, and I'm not a very good hunter, but I was hunting, with a group, and we were out in the middle of nowhere in West Texas. We weren't too far from the Mexican border, and at night, some of these migrants would come to our door, and they would want water or just some basic food and so on, and that's to me, it's just an incredibly heroic act that people would take the chance to come across the border and really put their life at risk to come into this country. And I just think it's such an important point that we remember. People always ask me, an economist, when will we know that America is in decline? And it's when 1 million people want to leave here rather than 1 million people want to come here, right? And the fact that people will risk their life still to this day to come here is something we should admire about our country and the people who come. So the answer to your question is, how do we, that migrant family that wants to come here, how do we allow them to have a legal channel? We've written a lot about this at the Wall Street Journal. There's absolutely no question that illegal immigration is a function of job opportunities here. I mean, if we get this economy growing, Jim Glassman, at 4%, and we get this unemployment rate down to 5%, which we should do, they're going to come. They're going to come for the very reason you said, sir. And so what we need to do is make sure that there are ways they can come here legally. And the idea of setting up an agriculture work program, the Bracero program has a lot of negative connotations to it, and there are a lot of abuses to the Mexicans.
The Bracero program was a program in the 1960s.
Well, so I think it began in the
Began in the 50s and ended.
But if you look at illegal immigration, if you want to know the single most effective program in the history of this country in reducing illegal immigration, it was the guest worker program in the early 60s. We reduced illegal immigration by 90%. By 90%, by having a plan where people could come here and here legally. So that's the obvious solution. By the way, the immigration bill before the Congress does that, and that will be much more effective than building these surveillance towers and putting triple fences and things on the border. Letting people come here in legal ways is the way to do it.
Great. Do we have another question? How about down here in the front? Sorry, please just wait for the mic. Thank you. Oh, that's okay.
Hi, Jerry Mannion with Carnegie. And I was just curious, a great panel, and we talked a lot about how, Texas economy has been, in fact, if you compare it to an Arizona or an Alabama, that because of the hospitality and the political environment had been so favorable for it and it's helped the economy. Are you worried about some of the harsh rhetoric that's starting to come out, from people who are elected about, about how it's sort of anti-immigrant that will affect your economy in any way?
Javier, thoughts on that?
Again, without getting political, I think the fact of the matter is that that we see a lot of very harsh rhetoric and ill-conceived legislation that oftentimes is very draconian toward immigrant communities. And we've seen it in Florida, we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Arizona, certainly. And at the end of the day, it really kind of, in our mind, again, we look at things from a particular perspective, and it's about commerce and economics. This kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that leads to the anti-immigrant legislation is not only bad for the immigrants. We need to consider that it's bad for the immigrant, it's bad for business, and that makes it bad for America. And that correlation, it's like 100% every time you look at these types of bills. And those that have passed in the states like Alabama and Arizona, the economies of those states have gone from bad to worse. That's a matter of record. I mean, there's nothing emotional about this. It's clinical. And so I think every state and the nation kind of needs to be very clear-headed about what we're attempting to do here. Certainly it's an emotional subject. It is, I think, on both ends of the spectrum. But as an organization that really kind of tries to, kind of put the camel through the eye of the needle, if you will, the best thing that we can, as an association, do is continue to remind people that there's some important economic and commercial implications to this type of draconian legislation.
That's our focus here too. We think that Americans, as Ambassador Glassman said in his introduction, they agree on immigration a lot more than we hear about, and a lot more than even I think a lot of us realize. And especially when we talk about these economic contributions, a lot of times that's the third or fourth thing someone thinks about when they think about immigration. And so really what we're trying to do here with this session and with all of our work, and you guys as well, I know, is bringing those facts to the people, to Americans, so they can have more informed debate on this topic. Pia?
This is an interesting place where Texas is very different from most other states. And I think in 2010, although we did during the 2010 state legislature have lots of bills introduced with some of the harsh rhetoric, and bills like Arizona, were being considered here, I don't think anything ended up passing. I think that however it works in Austin, it worked to the benefit certainly of the Texas economy, I would say, to reject those types of bills. And so it was really an astounding demonstration of just how different things are here. And so I'm not saying, again, that there aren't supporters of the harsh rhetoric and so forth. I'm sure there's lots of, and for good reasons as well. But I think in some case, and just Texas is just, it's another demonstration of how different we are here, and how it's interesting, and it also has significant meaning for the economy.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. Please wait for the microphone.
This is Patricia Stout from San Antonio. In talking to people that come here illegally just to work, and talking to people both in Mexico and here.
Sorry, did you say legally or illegally?
Illegally, both legally and illegally.
Mm-hmm.
This is the sentiment. People want to come to work here, but they want to go back home because their family is over there. So a worker permit is something that would be very beneficial because they really don't want to stay. Many of them stay here because if they go back, they can never come back. And I'm sure you know that one worker may be supporting 3 or 4 families in Mexico with the money that they earn in the States. But they are longing to go back. So I think facilitating the return of these workers would open a door of opportunity for other people to come and go back.
Sure.
And then they would not stay and become a burden, like what they call us sometimes. And I think that is something very provocative that should be, experimented on, because I myself, when I came here, I was longing to go back for 10 years.
Right, yeah,
Until I adapted myself and I made myself so happy. I don't want to go back because this is my home. But if the working permit would be for 1 year, it would be very, very good.
Right, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I think we're about out of time. Before we go, I just want to thank the panelists one last time. I think a key message that we learned from the session is that people are an asset. And a lot of times we forget about that. We think about different kinds of assets. We often forget that people, and especially immigrants, an asset, and they've helped drive the growth
I
of the
wish
economy.
that, the only regret is I wish that Paul Krugman had been here. Because Paul Krugman seems to think Texas is some kind of backwater state without, indoor plumbing and things like that, to see what's going on here and the dynamism. But this is what drives liberals crazy, actually, is that Texas is doing so well. So thank you for putting this on.
So if everyone could please thank the panelists, and we'll turn it over to Ambassador Glassman.